welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. One of the things that when I'm talking to people about digital identity and kind of explaining why ourselves as Northern Bloc just have much of a focus on the Canadian market is just like, there's so much that is contextual to culture. There's so much that's contextual to policies and laws in a specific country or legal jurisdiction. There's so much that's contextual to kind of the citizen government relationship and how one trusts another. There's so much that's contextual to the public-private sector kind of relationships. So this is where I'd like to start the conversation today, talking to yourself, Antti, who is in Finland and quite familiar with the market in Finland and just the general overall EU market. Would be interesting to just hear kind of what, just for context setting of what's kind of happening in the EU and in the Nordics, and how perhaps for a lot of the audience that's listening to this, that is maybe more North American audience, although we have a lot of people listening in Europe, so a shout out to everyone here listening from Europe. But for the folks that are kind of sitting in the US or in Canada, could you give a bit of a background maybe on what's happening in the EU and the Nordics as it relates to digital ID?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, really happy to be here and talk about all these things related to SSI and digital identities. So so I come from Finland, and Finland, for all those who don't know, is in the Nordics, way up north. We don't have polar bears, but we do have a lot of cool people in any case. But it's interesting. I've been following the discussion around SSI, and once from the very get-go, when back in, was it 2016 or 15, when Sovereign was released. And so it's been really interesting to see that there's a lot of discussion in SSI regarding untrust or mistrust towards governments and large corporations. And I fully understand that, but it's been really interesting to see that from the perspective of a Nordic citizen, where in Nordics, we have a very strong trust towards our governments. And especially in Finland, we actually have a particularly strong trust towards digital government as well, because we have, I think, quite well things at hand if you compare to many other nations. We have actually no reason to not trust our government in terms of handling our identities or any of our digital services in many places. So we actually have a lot of our registries. Many say that Finland has the best registries in the world. And I think I can agree. I don't know too much about other countries' registries, other than that. I just know that not all have them as in good condition as we have here in Finland. But in any case, what we do have is that we have quite well API-fied a lot of those crucial registries, and we have had a long focus on digitalizing these government services. We've had strong digital authentication from the 90s already. And so we haven't had really a strong issue with that. We've had that working based on, it was started by financial institutions, by banks back in the 90s. And it has since grown constantly year over year. It's used, and it's being used almost everywhere. And to this day, I have my mobile banks. I have my mobile strong authentication capabilities. I use them multiple times a day, many times. We use them in different services, whether they are private or public. We have our tax systems fully digitalized, company founding processes, different kinds of authorization mechanisms. Most of these are actually supplied by our government. So the basic premise that we already have is not necessarily exactly the same. So many people actually in Finland would say that, yeah, we have things well in hand. And I know that the same applies to Sweden and Norway as well. There's Bank ID there for a lot of the authentication capabilities. I would say that what we have here is that we have a very much different starting point. And we saw that especially when we started to discuss about SSI. So many of the pain points when we start to talk about self-sovereign identity and the control over personal data, control over how can I use it. We got even some questioning looks that, hey, we actually have this already. So what's the added benefits? Because they could show us that, hey, we have these registries, we have these APIs, and we have our partners that are using them. And this is actually functioning quite well. So that was our initial point that we faced, that, hey, SSI, all the wonderful things it has, it's not necessarily applied the same way, or it's not necessarily should be applied the same way here in Nordics as it may be in other countries. And what we're seeing also is a lot of good support from EU and other types of European nations, because what we see now, what many of you have seen and heard about, is the new E32 revision. E32 is the regulation of digital identities and signatures in Europe. And the first revision has been used for quite many years. Not all of the nations have been using it that well, though. But the new revision 2, which many call the European Digital Identity, that was released last June. And what it essentially does is that it takes the same mechanisms that SSI brought forth, which is the verifiable credentials and use of digital wallets, and it gave them regulatory context within what we have or have had for multiple years in E32. So it's very interesting to see the path where EU is taking it, and also what we have in Nordics is that we're going to have a quite strong regulative approach from E32 and EU to this, and whatever it in practice may be. And we already have quite strong digital governments that are really trying to focus on creating not only a public sector use of digital identity, but also public-private sector use. So it's going to be really interesting for the next few years, because we have already addressed a lot of challenges, and now we can focus really on how can we use the more advanced functionalities that SSI and digital wallets can bring. So it's going to be really fascinating years up ahead.
You're right. I think a lot of, at least a lot of the consumer digital identity or self-sovereign identity projects that come really have the whole theme of the institution is bad, or big tech is taking our data and we want to return control and stuff like that to the people. That's kind of been a narrative, and it's interesting to think about based on the context in Finland and perhaps in other Nordic countries or in the EU. That's I know in the EU there may be more trust or mistrust kind of narratives going on about big tech and stuff like that, and even government. But that's interesting to hear about Finland.
That's another thing, actually. The big tech, yeah, I agree. That's a narrative that we may be seeing, that there's mistrust towards those big techs. But at the other end, what we're seeing is that we have companies that realize the value of collaboration. And some companies in different industries are saying that, hey, let's set up collaborative hubs or data exchange hubs. So centralization in this sense is not seen necessarily as a bad thing, but what they want to do is retain control over that. So it's not being maintained or managed or controlled by one single entity. And I think that's a trend also that has been going on for years, is that centralization per se is not a bad thing, but ultimate control is actually a bad thing.
So if we think about the banks just being kind of the biggest private sector industry typically, and really collaborating closely with the public sector, being kind of under regulations. So where do the banks, based on kind of what you're seeing from your side, if there's already these kind of federated, I'm assuming federated digital identity models, and we have something similar in Canada as well. Like we and it really depends from province to province, kind of what they have in place. But there's certain places where there's already kind of there's strong assurance around an ID, and often they're able to use kind of an intermediary as a bank to do a federated login to authenticate and gain access and such. So is it similar where there's kind of banks play that role of you know, since they know the customer in a lot of use cases, they're able to have that strong assurance on data. And how do they see the path towards, because it's one thing of being kind of an identity provider or assuring digital identities, but it's another thing of kind of issuing that outside of your four walls as a bank, right? Do the financial institutions kind of see that on-ramp or that path or the benefits to kind of transitioning from federated to self-sovereign?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, and yeah, you're correct. So the authentication scheme is a federated scheme here as well. And what's interesting is that strong authentication is not anymore seen as a business. So it's not profitable business anymore. And one key reason for that is that in Finland, it was regulated that there is a certain cap limit to cost per authentication for websites. So it actually meant that whoever is providing that authentication capability cannot really make big business out of it. That has really led to the situation that providing strong authentication is not seen as a business, but what you can derive from that could be business worthy. But then again, what we have for financial institutions, is very high regulation. So there's a very strong regulative stance on how can you provide any kind of information about that data. But that's where I see banks really looking into is that, and when I mentioned that we should look into more advanced capabilities of SSI, this is, I think, where we are seeing interest towards is that, okay, we have the authentication covered, but how can we use in an ecosystem data so that we don't bleed out data? Because, you know, giving access to data would be easy enough, but how can we ensure that that data is not misused, or that data there is easy access, so it's not all necessarily federated or the user experience suffers. So SSI, I think, provides certain capabilities that really enable this ecosystem-centric thinking. Now, what I mentioned earlier is that we have a lot of hub-centric thinking. That we have centralized hubs, and those centralized hubs may be owned by coalitions or consortiums. But ecosystems are more, I would say, data-centric and more human-centric or end-user-centric. And this means that we can have in an ecosystem much more clear roles, and also attach much more clear governance to those roles, and also provide those access capabilities across those system borders that we previously haven't necessarily had. Because the need for a hub has been that, hey, we need a centralized place that can provide APIs, and maybe that hub is an aggregator that aggregates data from different data sources. So then we can all benefit from that. So it's sort of you win some, you lose some in that scenario. But in an ecosystem, what I see is really that a company, for example, like a bank or a financial institution or any other kind of player, can really assert that I have these strengths, that I can say something about this person, or I have a service that is part of a value chain that needs some kind of assurance or verification or trust or data. And I would want to have a standardized mechanism to access that. And now, how can I do that if I, let's say, do the service face to face, whether that's in a bus or railways, or doing digitally, or maybe you face a drone or a vending machine or whatnot. So the key is really to understand what kind of capabilities does SSI give you when you have a digital wallet in your hand, and you face the need for digital interactions. Now, a bank can provide different types of assurances. So that's where you see the value service. Right now, up to this point, any kind of assurance for data, what we need to have is done through a strong authentication mechanism. So you can imagine, let's say in the future, I like to always use this for some reason, that if you have a pizza delivery drone, it delivers you a pizza, and you need to verify that, hey, I'm the guy who delivered that pizza, and I'm using a decentralized identity wallet, not necessarily a service from a food courier or anybody else. So how can I do that? It's really about asserting that I am the one that you should give this pizza to, or maybe it's some kind of a business interaction that I'm doing a Craigslist type of transaction where I need to prove that I am the same person that you're transacting with, or I have the money here. You can safely do a transaction with me. And that kind of value where a bank knows something about me is really valuable. So it doesn't have to do with strong authentication anymore. It's really about providing access to that information, or, just from a verifiable credentials perspective, provide that information. But there's much more to that, I see. But that's sort of like the basic interaction pattern that I see that's happening. So I see those banks really seeing value from the additional trust that they can build, or maybe even receive, optimize their business when they receive something in, let's say, structured format or in a verifiable format.
If we just focus on banks still for a little bit, like there are clear benefits for a bank to become a consumer, meaning or a verifier of government issued verifiable credentials. And in any sector where, or in any country where a government or a specific government is issuing digital identities to citizens, that's kind of one of the first use cases you see all the time, is that, hey, the amount of due diligence that I have to do as a financial institution to extend credit or financial services to a person, I could do that. I could lower the friction in that process, make it quicker to give them kind of that financing or those financial services. And at the same time, I could put a check mark beside my due diligence, my KYC, whatever that process is. That's like a very easy kind of first use case to understand. And I often, when we talk about kind of the classic verifiable credential triangle or trust diamond, the verifier use cases are typically the use cases where you see kind of the ROI or the business value, because that's where you're kind of improving a specific process. So when kind of the private sector now is looking at this and saying, okay, there's going to be infrastructure that's laid out from the government or collaboration with the government, where we're going to have a verifiable data registry. Perhaps we're going to have different wallet solutions available in the market. We're going to have an issuance or supply of digital IDs that are going to be injected into the economy as kind of a public good by the government. How do you look at kind of where do I fit with it within the ecosystem, right? And that's perhaps you said that there's, at least in Finland, like companies or organizations see a lot of value in collaboration. So maybe it's a little further advanced in kind of the thinking there. But how do you kind of group the ecosystem together? How do you figure out now where, kind of based on the use cases I want to do I have to be an issuer perhaps? Do I want to have a wallet? Is there a business model in myself having a wallet in there? How do I look as an organization that, with this kind of new reality coming, how could I position myself appropriately within my ecosystem? And what is even my ecosystem in this if it's decentralized?
Yeah. Okay, that's a wonderful question. So, and to be honest, I think we're many times thinking this from too much from the lenses of the new technology like SSI, that's, hey, we have this trust triangle and I'm an issuer who can use this data, and not enough from the lens of the industries, because we have industries that are hundreds of years old and they've survived all tech changes. And they're just picking the best apples there, that, hey, we're using this for certain things. So what's not changing too much is that what's the basic business model? And I think that's where we should really get much more effort, is that we get people who understand both the capabilities of SSI and the new wallet technologies and standards that we're using, and who understand the industries ins and outs and what actually is required by those industries. And I think that's where we start to find new kind of ideas, not just the idea that, hey, I am an issuer who can use my data, or I'm a verifier and I need certain data, who can provide that, but more like, what's the full ecosystem? What's the full value chain? We need to think now from the distributed value chain perspective. And its value chain is really easy to understand from, let's say, supply chain perspective. When you have a clear linear supply chain, you have those factories that provide provide certain products, and they're being transported. They may be using multiple transports, and then they are used by retailer and then to the owner. So that's sort of a easy to understand value chain. But what if you have a little bit more complex value chain that is really based on data, not necessarily physical goods? One thing that I really love to show as an example is receipts, e-receipts, electronic purchase receipts, for example. And that was I just had a meeting about that today earlier, and it was really interesting area because now if you think about purchase receipts from SSI perspective, what you have there is you have an object which you need to prove something about it, because what you need that receipt for is that you need to show that it's a proof of purchase that you use to say that, hey, maybe this product has a defect, so I need to exchange it or return it. That's one clear thing, which means that I just need to show that I have purchased this product and it hasn't been returned earlier, so this is almost the same product at least. Then if I sell that and it still has some kind of warranty, I need to change ownership of that receipt. And so then the ownership of the product and the receipt goes to another person, and they may actually be able to return that. And now when we move into digital era, obviously we don't want paper receipts anymore. We want to have the easiest. You can lose paper receipts easily. They can break, and everybody knows how problematic that is. So when you go into the electronic receipts, we have those in many retailers have already electronic receipts. For example, my wife bought me a Christmas gift. It was a wonderful gift, but I need to return it. Sorry, wife, but she understands. But the problem was that it was an electronic receipt, and I went to there. I got a screenshot of that receipt, and I wanted to exchange it. So they said, we can't do this. I'm like, okay, why not? Well, this is a copy, and we don't know if this is a copy of a copy of a copy, and you're just returning a product. So I should have thought it earlier, because this is our domain already, that uniqueness and identity of things. But yeah, what is needed to provide really is that, okay, this is a proof of purchase, and I have the original, or I have the authorization to use that original. So there's two things that are happening in e-receipts. One is that I need to be able to prove control over the original entity, which is essentially the e-receipt. Now, what we have in SSI world is DIDs. DIDs are essentially proving control over an identifier. And an identifier can be attached to something like a receipt. A receipt is essentially a collection of information, rows about purchase rows, and the receipt is essentially then linked to that information. So when you have a receipt, you have a receipt ecosystem where you could really do this easily if you think about it, using DIDs, verifiable credentials, and the whole SSI ecosystem. And what you just need is to understand the value chain. How is a receipt formed? How is it given to a digital wallet? How is my wallet going to be proving control over that? If I lose my wallet, how can I retain that digital receipt again? If I sell my product, how can I give that receipt forward to another one? And now when you start to think about it, there are certain things that start to pop up. For example, if I am a loyalty member of one retailer and I sell my product to another person who is not a member of that retailer, that person should not need to be a member of that retailer, the original seller. They just need to have access to that receipt. That's all. So you should not require that the other person needs to become a member of that retailer's loyalty program. So that's unequal. That's unfair. So that's why what you need a way to understand how a generic electronic receipt is transferred from first one issuer system, which in this case would be the retailer, to my digital wallet, which can be any provider's wallet, then possibly to another consumer wallet, which again could be anybody's wallet. And they would need to be able to provide ownership of that receipt. and not necessarily even see that I am the previous owner, that whoever has that shouldn't be able to track that who have been those previous owners of this. So then you start to really realize that, hey, we have very interesting scenario here, because the retailer is in any case handling the receipt data, and I need to be able to handle the metadata, the ownership data, and control access to that ownership. And then I need to be providing access or even transferring access to that receipt to some other person. And then we have a value chain where the value is not only about me getting issuer data and proving that to somebody else, but we may have a chain of 3, 4, 5 different parties. And the value is realized by different ways, because the value can be realized either when you refund things, it could be realized in financing things when you go, or maybe something breaks and you to prove that value to insurance agency. You want a bank to finance this, so you need to prove that to a bank. So you have a much more complex and multi-branched value chain. And then you start to see the value, that it's not only about just the triangle, the single triangle, but you really get the feel of what is possible with these really core standards that are not just about the basic triangle or diamond that we have.
That's a quite interesting use case about the e-receipts. And it's funny, some of the examples you were giving, I'd been writing down some of these as well, because you could think that, and then I often tell people that I think people underestimate the value of having credentials in a wallet owned and controlled by yourself from different places, right? Because there has never been an opportunity to combine that much verifiable data together. And by combining different types of data together, or it could just be different, it could be the same schema like receipts, but I have receipts for everything in my life together. That supply of receipts in this one place that is verifiable unlocks tremendous value. Like you kind of mentioned, you could get financing. Maybe I want to get some liquidity and I want to get financing against things that I bought or assets that I have, and I can now prove that I own these assets altogether to a specific place. So that's what it's difficult for an organization to think as well. It's like when I'm so used to working within my 4 walls and I have a value chain, and most companies are not vertically integrated. I think we're starting to see a little bit of a trend like that in some manufacturing sectors and such, but most companies are not vertically integrated. We're seeing these supply chain issues globally affect a lot of businesses because of that. But it's easy enough to understand kind of what your value chain is for an end product that you're kind of creating. But if I'm a bank and I say, hey, I have an opportunity to consume credentials to lower my costs and improve user experience for onboarding, how do I keep up with all these different ecosystems that are forming here? Because tomorrow I may see, hey, there's a pretty robust e-receipt ecosystem that's forming here. I typically don't have, like, these retailers are not in my traditional value chain, but hey, there's a lot of value here because I could actually go lend money in this ecosystem here. So that's where it's kind of the, I guess you're often in new innovations and dependent on different parties in your value chain to innovate, but there's new value chains that are going to be available, I guess, with the proliferation or supply of new credentials that you can't even think about today. So to your point earlier, you stick to what your business model is and stuff like that, which for a bank, it's to loan money and get interest on that, basically. That stays the same, and that stays the same lending into an e-receipts kind of market, but it's a new market that's available for you.
Yeah, I think that's what we're going to see when we see the whole identity community, the decentralized identity community mature. Because what I expect to see is that we're going to see a mass of these ecosystems forming, and hopefully at least we're going to see them utilizing similar standards and specifications. We all know the W3C DID spec and verifiable credentials, and I think now trust over IP has some wonderful stuff brewing up. And so once we start to get further on, for example, I think it was just announced the Glyph as part of Trust Over IP Foundation is really ramping up their service of verifiable legal entity identifiers, which I think a prime example of an ecosystem that aims to be a generic ecosystem for company identities that can help other ecosystems form. So we may be seeing these kind of meta systems or meta ecosystems like Life's verifiable ways that really accelerate adoption of new ecosystems. But because you always have to remember that even though we are a globalized community, globally and digital identity-wise, businesses are not always global. And businesses and ecosystems function more actually locally and nationally than they do globally. So the main interest is still on your national and local levels and enabling that business. And then for some, and even for some, it's really about extending these ecosystems to work with other ecosystems. And I see this is a really good and huge possibility for EU, especially Canada as well, obviously, with your expertise and leadership in using PCTF and others. So it's wonderful to see that. So what we're seeing is that, and hoping at least, that there's much more collaboration between nations, whether they are national ID networks like Germany has ID Union. In Finland, we have Findinet, and we're similar things to, so we're essentially all identity networks or collaboration of organizations that come together. We're cooperatives that want to establish digital identity networks and SSI capabilities for our nations. So the next is that how do we contact and how do we combine our strengths to bring together these industry ecosystems? Because some of the industry ecosystems may be global and they may have already established governance globally, but some of, and even I would say most of them, are actually local and national that may have niche use cases that extend cross borders. And so for these cases, I think it's really imperative that we have collaboration between these ecosystems. And because we already have collaboration on lower levels, meaning that we have the SSI standards that are already quite well accepted, then we can start to focus on how do we utilize these technical standards to bridge the governance interoperability and the business interoperability. So I think that's what we're going to see, is that we're going to see a plethora of these ecosystems forming on different layers. They may be national, more generic ones like we have in ID unions, Alastria in Spain, and Dutch Trust Network, and Findi in Finland. So those are more generic ones, but I do hope and I do see that we're going to see much more the industry level ecosystems like e-receipts forming. And it may be that it starts with in our case, with Finnish sector actually forming that in a public-private partnership, but extending that to also others. And I don't know exactly what's the e-receipt situation in other European countries, but I would definitely see that if other countries would like to participate in that, that's a collaboration opportunity. And also, given that there's probably some international governance authorities also in that area, there's hopefully some kind of collaboration to make that international as well. So, but yeah, I see that really happening, that we're going to see not that much focusing on ecosystem specific technical functionality, that hey, we're going to build a bespoke solution for us, but more like let's use these generic technical capabilities that SSI offers and build an industry specific solution, or a solution that utilizes existing wallets. So we don't need to do that because we don't want to do that. Like supply chain and logistics is an area which doesn't really care too much about or doesn't want to necessarily partake in the end user business. End users just need to know that, hey, where's my stuff coming? What's the ETA on my deliveries? And that's just, the tip of the iceberg. So then it's really much more useful for other businesses to have that end user and customer relationship and focus on that area, and just, interact with the logistics sector, with the supply chain through other means like the SSI is doing.
I often see a lot of similarities just because generally SSI is early stage. I had been in the world of blockchain and kind of a lot of conversations in enterprise blockchain. We could argue what that means, and the value or the lack of value or whatever in these areas. But one of the big issues that I had seen over the years in this enterprise blockchain space was that it was difficult. I think it was difficult, one, for different entities to figure out how to collaborate together, but then to figure out how to set up a governance structure together, and even to figure out kind of what do you necessarily need to have a certain amount of control or influence over the governance? Do you just need to be kind of a consumer of this governance model? Is that an area that when you're working with different companies that, and you've kind of described there's different types, right? You could have these horizontal kind of meta ecosystems, or you could have the vertical ones. But how do you decide kind of which ones to participate in, to have influence in? And the enterprise consortium blockchain type of thing never really took off very much. There are some projects, but generally, I would say that there's been a lot of projects that stalled or stopped just because the value creation demonstration just stalled. How do we avoid that, or how do we make it easier to kind of participate in these models, and knowing when to participate actively and participate in the governance, and then knowing when to just be a consumer?
Oh yeah, I recognize that problem definitely, and I've been following close by many of those kind of projects, if you will. And I've noticed that the same thing applies there. That it's really challenging to find the common governance ground, and I think one of the reasons why this private blockchain or enterprise blockchain area didn't really, or hasn't flown really that far as we expected, I think is that it's been really difficult, first of all, to get these off the ground, and many have realized that, hey, it's not necessarily fulfilling the promises that we expected, and that there's much more centralization than we initially needed, just because that it's so hard to create distributed governance. Second thing that I see that was happening is that there's been a lack of standards. That even though we've had blockchain stuff there, it's been quite bespoke, that there's great solutions. But when you want to really cross the chasm to other industries or utilize the same thing in other use cases, you've needed to do the same thing over and over again. Or it's more of the question is that to which level you're actually committing yourself to. And it's really hard. And it's actually, I would say, almost not favorable or unacceptable even to commit to certain technologies. It's more definitely something we should strive for, is to commit to standards and commit to building the next generation standards. And that's why I really love, and why I see the difference of SSI versus the blockchain community, is that what we're seeing is that SSI is focusing a lot on the standards. And we're saying that, hey, yeah, we realize that this is a problem, and we've had these standards like OpenID Connect for a long time, federated identity standards and others, and they've been solving it. And if we're now building something, we should do the same or even better. And I think that's one key aspect, is that with SSI, the focus on standards is really good. I think it's becoming much more mature, and we're getting the basic building blocks there, and they're being approved by the community in DIDs and verifiable credentials and others, and now we get to focus on how do we implement that. So I see much more promise in SSI and implementing that, because the focus is really on building the generic building blocks. And if you look at trust over IP, trust over IP is essentially the first three layers. It's really about how do we standardize these so that the top layer, which really makes the value, the layer 4, the ecosystem layer, that they can really start to reap the value. Obviously, there's value in other levels as well, but I think that's really the key issue there. That how do we build the key building blocks, and that we're going to build our house on the rock. that we're finding the bedrock, we're building our house on the bedrock, and the ecosystem can really stand on standards and specifications that are well known and accepted by the community, not only locally but globally, and then build on top of that. So I think that's really the key, which is why I believe that SSI will be striving towards really high acceptance and high use, is that there's definitely a good focus on those standards. But not only that, but there's only focus on how do we bridge the gap from existing standards and from existing adoption, for example, from federated identity technologies to the SSI world. So I'm really loving what I'm seeing from OpenID Foundation with the self-issued OpenID providers and those verifiable presentations for OpenIDs and the bridges that we're seeing being built. So I'm really hoping and trusting that this is something that will have a long-lasting effect.
I guess the ones that did make the revenue on a lot of these failed enterprise blockchain projects were the cloud providers or the ones hosting the nodes. So I know that it ended up being that was the business model for these projects, even if they didn't really reap that much value in the grander sense of things.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the enterprise blockchain is really, the question was also, again, that, okay, how do we show this to the end user? And the goal was obviously that, well, we shouldn't show to the end user. So it was still, it was lacking the full, let's say, end-to-end stack. And even though there's a lot of problems, and there still is, so don't get me wrong, I love the implementations that we're seeing in blockchain. And I do see that, for example, the metaverse there's going to be a lot of great stuff there. It's not going to be the end all be all of things. It's not going to necessarily change the world like we see many of the proponents of metaverse saying. I'm not thinking that that's going to be it. I'm just thinking that we're going to see a lot more change in terms of how do we use digital services, and the existing service providers are still going to be there. They're just going to be adapting to the new situation that, hey, we're going to have digital wallets. How can we use those digital wallets? And in the SSI scheme of things, it's the digital wallet is the prime citizen, if you will. So it's really the prime thing there. Whereas in blockchain world, especially in the public permissionless world, you need to know a lot of technology to get your hands on. You need to understand the whole scheme of things to get your hands on digital wallets and understand how crypto works, and really to bridge the gap to the end user. You need to really handle the governance side, the technical side, the liability side, the service side. And to be honest, the services end is really what the familiar companies are the best at. They've been practicing that for hundreds of years. And in the digital world things, they've been doing that for the past 50 years already. That how to use digital things, how the services work. That's for the past 30 years. That's all that they've been learning.
That's interesting too. And then, but back to the same point of what do you need to control and not control. Like, I think just taking a data-centric lens on things, and also just trying to understand what are the properties you're seeking, or the benefits that you're seeking. You could often decide to use different sources of data for different initiatives, right? You don't have to set up your own thing all the time. You could just be a consumer of it. And like you mentioned, you just need to build the value adds on top of that to offer a better product or a better service to your end users. And companies that sell to end users, that's what they really excel at doing. It's also interesting when you're talking about kind of the bridges and a lot of the good stuff happening with the self-asserted OpenID work. One of the areas that I've talked a little bit on this podcast to folks before, and I've always kind of been interested in what the value is of doing this, because there's going to be kind of an on-ramp period of convincing or making the business cases for entities that are source data owners to decide that they want to actually become just direct issuers of this data to consumers, right? For example, the bank issuing verified banking credentials, or your merchant issuing the verifiable e-receipts type of thing, right? So there's been a big movement anyways in kind of the digital transformation realm, which has to do with just straightforward digitizing stuff, right? And in our identity space, like we see that with digitizing government IDs and doing stuff like that, even digitizing documents. There's companies that are raising hundreds of millions of dollars now to just OCR documents in a good way to help with kind of that digitization of things. Do you see that digitization of things kind of being something that is going to speed up the adoption of self-sovereign identity, meaning you kind of need to have these proxy issuers in place? Because do I necessarily need the merchants to be the direct issuers of receipts? If I have a service in the middle that provides high assurance on that, it unlocks value for someone on the verification side of things. And so would be interesting to hear if you have any thoughts on that stuff. And the reason I bring this up too is that self-sovereign identity done right moves you away from kind of API centricity, which is kind of what's happening today across businesses. This introduces more kind of APIs and integrations and stuff like that. But I think people also underestimate the benefits of an organization being set up with wallets, with agents. For one, your procurement process as an organization completely changes. I don't need to onboard vendor by vendor for services. I could just kind of, if I have the direct connections established, I could start consuming stuff. So kind of a long rant from my side here, but would be interested to hear, I guess, just to recap on, is there a need for these kind of proxy issuers? How do they fit into the whole model? And then does that cause more of a problem, maybe, that we're introducing more APIs when we're trying to move away from it? Would be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, first of all, I love everything you just said, because I've been thinking that digitization versus digitalization, because there is a clear difference there. And what you essentially are thinking about, that there's a difference of how do you change from the analog world and digitize your value chain into what is a native digital value chain. So there's a difference there, but we shouldn't go there too deeply. And another thing I really love is that I've been talking about APIs, and APIification is really, I love the idea, and I've always been supporter of that. But what I've been seeing is that APIs are, in a way, they're just, well, they are dumb interfaces. And what we really want to have is to have that verifiability outside of the APIs. Now, if you think about a company that has a lot of information about a person, and they could use value out of that. And there's a difference, actually. What I think this will change is that it's not necessarily to share necessarily data. That's one thing, but to share attestations of me. So, for example, a bank may not necessarily give out any kind of information about my mortgage, but what they can say is that, hey, I've been a good mortgage payer. So you can trust if I take a loan, I'm likely to pay that back, or some other kind of proof that or that I'm a wholeheartedly good guy. But in any case, what the thing is that with just a basic API, you're limited to that session. Generally, you're limited to that session you have with that API provider. Whereas with SSI and credentials, you're able to take that information and use that later on, one or multiple times. And I think that just as a technical capability, that is super powerful and really changes our way and I'm already seeing that it changes our way, not only in governance ways. So we cannot just say that this session needs to be unique, but we need to say that, hey, the way that we do data authorization or data authentication, verification of the integrity of that data is not anymore system or platform centric. So it's really about finding a way to understand how the data verification is being handled. Now to the question of whether or not these proxies are needed, and I see that, yeah, definitely they are needed. And it becomes even more relevant when you start to think it not from the issuer perspective, that one issuer, and then we would have multiple aggregators, but what is the optimal value chain for a customer in this business? And in there, it may be that there may be instances where customer is much more closer to a service provider that can act as a data aggregator or a credential aggregator, or what may you call it. And the value of that it's just much more fluent user interface, or the customer experience of that value chain is much more fluent if you bring in another player. Or maybe it is that the data holder, who is the source of the data, is not interested in acting in the customer or end user space. So it's not valuable for them. It's actually, they just see it as a cost. Some organizations may see customer interface as a cost because they don't necessarily get any kind of value from that customer interface. They would rather give that to some of their partners. So in that sense, you could use these proxies just to handle the customer interface, provide the service as part of their usual service, and then be able to issue credentials that are issued by another party. So it's really about the fluency of that value chain and understanding the value chain as a whole, not just from that single triangle or a single issuer or a single verifier perspective, but and what is that whole value chain. And there's a book called The Wide Lens by Ron Adner, a wonderful book. I really recommend that for anybody listening to this. And it talks about understanding how value chains are formed in an ecosystem. And it really has tremendous case studies about how some ecosystems have failed, where some ecosystems have been too early, or they have been doing all the right things, but they've been looking the business completely wrong, or even some cases where, for example, there is a very good example of a digital cinema case where it was, if I recall, it was a situation where was a digital cinema projector companies wanted to sell new projectors, to raise the level of the projector quality and bring about HD or was even 3D qualities. But there was a problem that the theaters couldn't afford it. And there was a problem that there was one party in the whole ecosystem that couldn't get any value out of this. They actually got only negative value. So it was a cost to them. So only in the long run, if you could have a financing mechanism or a business mechanism that would benefit the theaters to get more out of this new technology, they could make this ecosystem work. So that meant that they needed to bring in new players to enable the theaters get better business value from the adoption, from the early stages of the technology change. And later on, they could phase out those new players just to make that ecosystem work. And I think that's a tremendous book for all of us in the identity community and decentralized community in general to learn from. That there's a lot of tools there as well, how to deal with the ecosystem and the value, just the value chain and different kinds of roles in that value chain. And when you start to take your wider lens, so to speak, so when you start to look at not only the smaller triangle or diamond, but look the whole value chain of what this data or SSI credentials or assurances or what you may have there, and what is the real value, who gets what kind of value, you start to see how would you build these kind of valuable ecosystems. And you also start to see whom do I need to be partaking in this ecosystem to make it work. And so yeah, it's really interesting to see this, and especially like I mentioned earlier, the Glyph ecosystem is one of those. Is that I would definitely want to see a mapping of that who could get value from the whole ecosystem, not just from the first steps that Glyph is currently describing. I definitely want to understand better, and I see there's a lot of potential there, and I see the same kind of potential for. And actually even bigger potential for e-receipts that I mentioned and other types of things. So yeah, just let's widen the lens and see the big picture.
At least for any vertical digital trust ecosystem, and I know you spend a lot of time at the Trust Over IP, and you're a big contributor, and you spend a lot of time thinking about ecosystem formation, obviously, as per the conversation that we're having here today. But we have a company like Northern Block as a company, like we've spent a lot of time just thinking about what onboarding to a decentralized architecture looks like in a trusted manner, right? And something like Glyph provides you with perhaps a layer where you're able to keep doing stuff in a self-sovereign manner. you're able to have that decentralized governance. I want to make sure that in my specific vertical ecosystem, if it's e-receipts or what, I want to make sure that you know, the entities that are interacting in there have some level of authenticity aligned to what I'm trying to achieve in there. So something like Glyph just gives you the ability to go tap into corporate registries and stuff like that in a verifiable manner, to just have that check mark in a fully privacy preserving way, but you could still guarantee kind of a high level of authenticity in your network. And that unlocks tremendous opportunities, right? At the end of the day, all of what we're doing here is to unlock digital trust, right? So now that I have trusted entities, I don't even need to know the entity on the other side of things. I don't need to be reliant on the way that I trust people that I do business with today. It's an expensive process. I could just trust the system, right? And stuff like that gives you the ability to have that high level of trust where I could do business with someone that perhaps I wasn't able to do business with yesterday, or I didn't want to, or it was just not possible. It creates more liquidity almost in the types of interactions that you could have there. The other thing you mentioned, which I find quite interesting, is kind of, and having read part of the Wide Lens book after your recommendation here, there are some very interesting use cases in there. I feel that often, and we've talked about this verifiable trust triangle or diamond, it's so limiting to what kind of actually should be the business value or the interactions happening in an ecosystem. And it's used so often, and I use it as well, because when you're giving someone, and I'm sure when you're having conversations with people and you're onboarding them to the subject of self-sovereign ID, that it's a tool that I use, and I'm sure you use at times too, and it helps understand kind of what the big differences are, right? And starts to just get the wheels turning in people's heads. But in, I guess, yourself working with different companies in a sales cycle type of thing, once the prospective client or the ecosystem partners or whoever you're working with have established a good enough understanding of the frameworks and everything that we use in self-sovereign identity, do you have a template, or how do you kind of create this wider lens approach in SSI? How do you get away from the trust triangle or diamond?
Yeah, so it boils down to, again, getting your hands dirty with the industry. And I think that's something, just forgetting that diamond first of all. You need to forget that, understand, again, what's the value chain of that ecosystem. And it really means essentially to ask questions that, hey, okay, what is necessary for this transaction to happen? You start to realize, okay, you need that information. Okay, where do you get that information? All right, here. Maybe ask another question that where do they get that information? Are they a proxy, or are they using some other information? And you start to gather a blueprint essentially of players and parties, stakeholders in that, and you start to understand that who plays an important role of this within this ecosystem, within this value chain, and then also to understand what is really key for this, because it's really about what is the value producing transaction, and what are the components that form the really valuable bits of that. So the necessary bits that make it work, and what are the actual the extraneous, just those that make it easier. And once you start to understand the value, you start to find out the different stakeholders and the parties that partake in that transaction, or the previous steps in that transaction, or even the subsequent steps in that ecosystem, and that's where you start to then realize that, all right, so now we have this kind of blueprint, the big value blueprint and value chain of this ecosystem or this business. How could we solve this with the capabilities we have with SSI? And that's where you need to have really that, because as I mentioned, we need to get our hands dirty. We need to have people who understand the industries and people who understand the technology. And it really transcends that the basic architects or basic consultants or business consultants. And we need to get more of those unicorns up and running here that understand both sides. And then start to design this. How would this look if it would be rebuilt with SSI. Now that's sort of the dream situation, because that really shows that if we would build this ecosystem and value chain today from the scratch, how would it look like? Then we would get this ultimate goal of what would be really something beautiful that we would want to design. It's not necessarily something we can immediately onboard into or just say that, okay, let's do it like this. There's usually multiple steps because we have legacy systems, we have established businesses and systems that we need to onboard as well. So it just may mean that we find that what is the one smallest new thing we can implement that brings value, and really think it from step by step. So that if we change this thing, that let's say that we have integration with a data source now, that if we would change this into a verifiable credential, what would it change? If we would give our end user the possibility to get access to some of the data we have in this value chain, what would it change? Would it bring new values? Just to find the smallest common denominator of what would increase value in the value chain, or what would change something in the value chain that would maybe optimize it or take out a player that is just providing something that could be done somehow else in this value chain. Removing some kind of a proxy. That's one of the easiest things to do usually in digitalization, and just working from there on. And then it's really about, if this is what is the urgency factor of that value. So there may be different kind of drivers of the urgency. So there, for example, the governance aspect, the regulatory aspect of things, that if there's change in regulation like the EIDAS, it's a huge urgency factor, because what EIDAS version 2 states essentially is that certain industries need to accept the digital wallets. So there's an urgency factor there to understand that how does this verification procedure that we need to do in order to verify these new European identification scheme, how does it change our business? That if we have a wallet, how does this change our digital wallet kind of idea of our business? Do we want to be a wallet provider? Is it possible to be a wallet provider in our nation's scheme, in our nation's system? So it really, that's where we start. We understand the industry, understand the business, then we understand the urgency and the drivers of that change. And then how do we start? What are the key players of that value chain, and what are the drivers of those players? So my takeaway here is that if we want to be successful in adopting and creating self-sovereign identity or digital identity-based ecosystems, we really need to understand the ecosystem as a whole, and we need to be helping industries orchestrate that ecosystem to really gain full benefit of what these new SSI capabilities bring.
And I often think, and again, just drawing similar parallels to other blockchain stuff, and I sometimes don't like to talk or bring blockchain into SSI conversations because it puts people in different directions than they should be going into. But often people with these new innovative technologies or frameworks are just thinking about disrupting and creating so much innovation without realizing that, like, I'm going to create this new ecosystem to disrupt this industry or that industry, but not taking the lens that these things already exist. They're very mature. Like you said, there's industries and companies that have been running for hundreds of years, and they understand their customers very well. They understand the economics of their industry very well. So it's all about just seeing how these things could complement what they're doing currently today. And totally agree with you. The easiest way to convince someone to adapt something new is if there are compliance or regulatory reasons to do so. I'd be interested then, just taking that kind of from that lens, just talking about there's the EIDAS stuff. So companies are trying to figure out how they're going to comply, what they have to do to comply. Do they want to adopt a wallet? Do they want to be a wallet provider? I think there's similar conversations happening in the Canadian market as well, where there's a lot of provinces that are kind of building their own wallets. There's the private sector trying to figure out, do they want to have their own wallets? Do they want to adopt other wallets? So I know obviously you're setting up ecosystems in Finland to use kind of the wallet. And the wallet is, at least for me, has been kind of beyond that verifiable trust triangle or diamond that we talk about. The next logical thing that I usually do in discussions is talk about the wallet, because it's kind of center to everything. So that's kind of the next piece to understand. And so with kind of your work designing and setting up the ecosystems in Finland and in the EU, there's the upcoming EU ID wallet. And so everyone's waiting for this wallet. What's exciting about that? And does it also have limitations, this wallet in particular that's coming out? What should people be aware of? And I'm sure some of the discussion around here is going to be helpful for folks even outside of the EU that are just looking at the similar concept in their environment.
So just to understand that there's the EU wallets data, the toolbox, EU EIDAS toolbox group that it's called, is still designing the first architectures and outlines of what would this wallet look like and what would this whole system look like. And there are multiple technologies that they're considering still. So there are federated mechanism, the ISO mobile driver's license standard is one that they're looking into and extending that. They're also looking into SSI standards and specs. So everything is still on the table. So we don't really know what the technology-wise things will be. I have heard a lot of good things about it, though. That there's some really good progress ongoing, and really excited to hear what's going on there later on. So what's EIDAS is going to be, and the European Digital Identity is going to be doing, is that each nation needs to have at least one digital wallet. So each member state needs to support either by themselves, either the government, the member state needs to provide the national digital wallet by themselves as a public sector, or they need to be able to also allow private sector parties to provide one or more wallets there as well. So we may see a situation where there's some nations have only one wallet, or some nations would have multiple wallets, and they would allow also private sector parties to have those wallets. So it's really the member states are allowed to do that. Now, what's interesting, and this really is going to be varying from nation to nation, is that what is the purpose of that wallet? Let's say, for example, I know that in Finland we're going to have a government wallet, and as I said, we have a very high trust in our governments, and so it's a positive thing that we're going to have a digital authentication from our governments and from our ministries. And so the question is that where can you use that, and to what all purposes should you be able to use that? Because there's a fine line of, and as I mentioned earlier, that authentication is not necessarily seen as a business anymore. It is a public utility, and I think that's what it should be. It should be a public utility available for all for free. And that's why when you start to consider that where's the fine line of how do you use those wallets for private sector use, for example, and how do you integrate that? So I think, and this is just my personal thinking, is that when we start to have these EU wallets, whether they are, let's say, hypothetically thinking that we would have a German wallet, maybe that would be based on a wallet provider that is also a provider in ID Union. The German identity network, SSI network. There's a German student coming to Finland, and they would need to purchase a student card. Maybe they are here for a few months, and they want to buy a public transportation ticket, and they want to have a student discount for that. So for that to happen, they would either need to pick up a Finnish wallet, which is not an optimal thing. We're not doing this for Germans. They would need to use probably English. We're probably not going to be translating that to German. It's not one of our official languages. So it's preferred probably that they want to use their own familiar wallet they bring from Germany. So what they can do is that they can provide proofs that, hey, I am this person from Germany, and I am a university student, and I'm actually studying here in Finland now. Can I get my public transportation ticket? And that's, if you think about that scenario, what it provides is really that our issuers in Finland would need to be able to issue things to a German wallet. That German wallet would need to provide their identity, or actually they would need to authenticate themselves in a way, or identify themselves in a way that it can be proved. And that's part of the EIDAS scheme. So all of these things actually are part of the IDA scheme, is that the the use of the identity credentials or identification credentials, and then like student credentials or even public transportation tickets, they would be part of that. But to actually use a public sector wallet for all of that, and let's say that you would use that not only for public transportation, but also so for some other private transportations, because you will have things like mobility as a service kind of things. We have private sector parties that offer, obviously we have Uber kind of things here. And what are those? The electric scooters that you can rent out here. So those are private sector things. You don't want to use a public sector wallet for that necessarily. So then it's a question that how would you use a private sector wallet that could be based on this public information that EIDAS brings? So then you will need to have already changed that. What's the provenance of this information that, let's say this German student could use a private sector service with their public sector wallets, and even extend that use and then jump into using maybe some other wallet, let's say a bank wallet they could use in Finland, that is based on the credentials, that is based on the EIDAS and the ID union schemes. So you become, it's sort of what is necessary for that value chain to form and what is most beneficial for that business value to be formed. And my thinking is not yet necessarily clear on everything, especially what is the user interface for jumping from one wallet to another wallet, or extending or chaining those credentials from one from let's say this kind of ID union governance area to the Finnish private sector wallet. So there definitely not everything is clear, and it shouldn't be clear yet. We're such in the early stages of this. But I do see the value in that we have a clear regulatory context that is across borders. And there are things that public sector wallets are and should be used to provide the base minimum of what you need in order to function in a digital society. You need to have your taxes, you need to have your basic authentication, you need to have some level of proving of your studentships or university degrees or whatnot. So these are things that need to be available for everybody. But in order to have a better commercial or customer experience, you likely want to have private sector wallets that are able to do the same thing. So then it's really about how does this work in different ecosystems? What is most beneficial? So it may be that we will get some wallets for some areas of your life. So you will have few wallets in use, or maybe even a super wallet, smart wallet that could be used in everywhere. But I would more think about that you will have a couple wallets for certain life areas, and you're able to use those in those areas, and they will be able to gather, you'll be able to gather multiple credentials to those certain wallets. But it remains to be seen, really. This is, I think, the interesting part is how do we start to develop the ecosystems, and what's going to be the user experience, not only within one ecosystem, but also between different ecosystems.
Yeah, these are all interesting questions, and I echo the thoughts that this hasn't been figured out yet. I think I agree that having a public sector wallet to access public sector services like your taxes or your healthcare or stuff like that perhaps makes sense. But then you start thinking about does that, to your discussion about taking the wide lens and looking at the ecosystem, does this perhaps just introduce too much cost and friction to adopt inside of maybe a private sector ecosystem or stuff like that? Are there limitations there? I think the authentication and the ID proofing thing are big questions as well, right? Where I think public sector wallets are something that the public sector feels comfortable with because they could control the assurance on the ID proofing and the authentication that needs to happen for a government issued credential to go and sit inside of there. But they don't necessarily want to make that portable yet, which defeats a bit of the self-sovereign purpose. But it's not portable because you don't really have control as the government over the processes that are being done to do ID proofing to get you up to kind of whatever level that you're comfortable with your own wallets today. Then you have the whole questions. Well, okay, if that's going to be the case, and then you're going to only be able to you'll only be able to have this one credential or these few credentials in this type of wallet. Do they perhaps, are they going to start reissuing credentials to different wallets in the future? Because you can't necessarily port them over. I think that there's a lot of interesting things that are being talked about, still need to be figured out. And I think will only be figured out with more and more collaboration between different ecosystems and public, private sector, technology providers and everything. Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Mathieu Glaude on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.